The invitation came apart in Henrietta's hands with a sound like a small bone breaking, and Edith Marlowe watched the two halves of it flutter down onto the workroom floor. For a moment, neither of them moved. The card had been thick, cream-laid, with the Duke of Ashbury's crest pressed into the corner in dove-grey ink, and now it lay in two pieces among the thread ends and pin shavings, the way a thing looks when it has stopped being a thing and become only paper. Henrietta's chin was high. Her pale gold ringlets caught the afternoon light from the single window, and her mouth was set in the particular shape it took when she had decided to enjoy something cruel. "There," Henrietta said. Now no one need be embarrassed. Edith did not pick up the pieces. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, across 4 years of sewing for the Carslake household, that the surest way to give Henrietta what she wanted was to let her see the wound. So she kept her hands where they were, flat against the half-finished bodice on the table, and she said nothing at all, and the silence between them grew until it had a weight of its own. It was Henrietta who broke it. She always did. "You cannot have thought you would actually attend," she said. And now there was a thread of uncertainty under the cruelty, the way there always is when a person realizes they have not been given the reaction they came for. A seamstress, at the Duke's own assembly, you would have stood at the wall the whole evening with everyone wondering whose servant you were. "The card had my name on it," Edith said. Her voice was level. "Miss Edith Marlowe, in the Duke's own hand, I think." It was a clerk's error. Henrietta stepped back from the table. "Someone copied a list wrong. Dukes do not invite the women who hem their cousins' gowns. You know that as well as I do. And you ought to thank me for sparing you the humiliation of finding it out in front of 300 people. Edith looked at the two halves of the card on the floor. The crest was on the left-hand piece. Her name was on the right. "I expect you are right," she said. And that, more than anything, was what undid Henrietta. She had wanted tears, or fury, or at the very least the trembling silence of a woman swallowing both. What she had instead was agreement, calm and flat and entirely unbothered, and it left her with nothing to push against. She made a small sound, half a laugh, and turned on her heel, and the workroom door clicked shut behind her, with a finality that did not feel like victory. Edith waited until the footsteps had gone down the passage. Then she knelt and gathered the two pieces of the card and laid them on the table beside the bodice, edge to edge, so that the crest and her name sat together again, as they had been meant to. She had made the gown Henrietta would wear to that assembly. She had cut it and fitted it and set every one of its 300 seed pearls by hand across 9 evenings, working by the lamp after the day's other custom was done, each pearl couched down with 2 stitches and a knot so it would not pull loose if it caught. 300 of them, 600 stitches, 300 knots, a labor so patient and so invisible that the woman who would wear it would never once think of the hours folded into it. That was the nature of the work. The better it was done, the less anyone saw the doing. A perfect seam is a seam no one notices. Edith had spent her life perfecting things that were designed to disappear, and she had made her peace with that long ago, or thought she had. She would deliver it in 2 days, finished and faultless, because that was the work, and the work didn't care who tore what. But she sat for a long moment, looking at the mended card on the table, the two halves not joined, but only touching, and she allowed herself exactly one thought before she put it away. She had wanted to go. That was the whole of it. She had wanted, for one evening, to stand in a room she had only ever seen from the service stair, and to be a guest in it rather than the woman who had made the curtains. The wanting was foolish. She knew it was foolish. She folded the 2 pieces of card into her apron pocket all the same, and she picked up her needle, and she went back to the pearls. What Edith did not know, because she had no way of knowing it, was that the Duke of Ashbury had not made an error of any kind. The town of Larkfield sat in a fold of green country 3 hours north of London, the kind of market town that had grown up around a bridge and a wool trade, and had never quite decided whether it was a village pretending to be a town or a town that missed being a village. It had one good street, a square with a cross in it, and an assembly room above the corn exchange that the better families used 6 times a year and spoke of as though it were a palace. Edith had lived there her whole life. Her father had kept a draper's shop on the good street until his eyes had failed him, and he had sold the lease and gone to live with his sister in Bath, where the air was said to be kinder. And Edith had stayed because a girl of 23 with a needle and no fortune stays where the custom is. She had taken the work with the Carslakes because the Carslakes paid, and paid promptly, and because Mrs. Carslake, whatever her faults, knew good sewing when she saw it and did not haggle. The faults were considerable. Mrs. Carslake had married a man of comfortable means, and spent the comfort entirely on the project of marrying her daughter Henrietta higher still, and the project had curdled her, the way a long ambition with no progress will. Henrietta had inherited the ambition without the patience. She was 19, pretty in the way that a porcelain figure is pretty, and convinced that the only thing standing between herself and a brilliant marriage was the insufficient grandeur of everyone around her. For 4 years Edith had sewed for them, and been to them a fixture, like the workroom or the back stair. They spoke in front of her as one speaks in front of furniture. It was through this carelessness that Edith had come to know a great deal more about the affairs of Larkfield's gentry than any of them would have credited. For a woman kneeling to pin a hem hears everything, and is assumed to hear nothing. It was also how she had come to know about the Duke. Roderick Vane, the 5th Duke of Ashbury, had come into the country the previous autumn to take possession of Ashbury Court, a great pale house of honey-coloured stone that sat on the ridge above Larkfield, and had stood half shut for a decade under the management of an absent owner. The town had talked of nothing else for a month. He was young to hold the title, not yet 35. He was unmarried, which set every mother in 3 parishes into motion. And he was, by all accounts, severe, exacting, and disinclined to the sort of warm public charm that the country had hoped for in its new duke. He had dismissed 2 stewards in his first season for keeping slovenly books. He attended church and spoke to no one after. He was, the consensus held, proud. Edith had never seen him. She had only made things that went into his house. This was the part the Carslakes did not know, because Edith had never told them, because it was the one piece of her professional life that was wholly her own. 18 months earlier, before the Duke himself had come north, his housekeeper at Ashbury Court had needed a quantity of fine work done quickly, new hangings for the long gallery, covers for a set of chairs, a set of linen for the state bedchamber, and had asked in the town for the best hand available. The best hand available was Edith Marlowe. She had done the work over a winter, quietly, under her own name, sending it up to the court by the carrier and receiving her payment by the same road, and she had never set foot in the house. When the new Duke arrived and found his gallery hung with curtains of a quality that did not match the slovenliness of the rest of the place, he had asked his housekeeper who had made them. "A Miss Marlowe, Your Grace," Mrs. Penhale had said. "In the town. The best needle in the county, and the most honest. She undercharged us by 1/3, and would not be talked into taking more." The Duke of Ashbury was a man who noticed things. He noticed the curtains. He had, over the following months, found a number of small reasons to send work down to Miss Marlowe in the town, and each time the work came back faultless and the bill came back honest, and he had formed, without ever having seen her face, a clear and growing regard for a person he knew entirely through the quality of her seams and the modesty of her accounts. When the time came to send out the cards for the great spring assembly, the first the court had hosted in a decade, the Duke had gone through the list his housekeeper prepared and added one name to it in his own hand. He had not made an error. He had made a decision. And he had no notion, sitting in his study above the town, that 2 days before the assembly, his decision would be torn in half on a workroom floor by a girl in rose-pink muslin who had never sewn a straight seam in her life. The gown for Henrietta was finished a day early. Edith carried it up to the Carslake house herself, folded in clean linen across both arms, and she was made to wait in the hall while Henrietta tried it on, and then to kneel and pin the final adjustments while Henrietta turned this way and that before the long glass, and found, as she always found, 3 small things wrong that were not wrong. "The waist sits high," Henrietta said. "It sits where you asked, miss. A half-inch higher than the fashion, you said, to lengthen the line." "Did I?" Henrietta studied herself. The gown was, in plain fact, the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, a rose-pink figured muslin over a slip of deeper rose, with the 300 seed pearls scattered across the bodice like the first stars of an evening, and she knew it, and the knowing made her generous in the particular way of a person who has gotten everything she wanted and can therefore afford a moment of grace. "Well, it will do. You have a use, Marlowe. I will say that for you." Edith set the last pin. "Thank you, miss. You are not still sulking about the card?" It was not a question. Henrietta watched her in the glass. "It would have done you no good to go. You see that now." "I have a great deal of work, miss." Edith rose and gathered her pins. "I would not have had the evening to spare in any case." This was not true, and both of them knew it was not true, but it was the kind of lie that lets 2 people leave a room without further damage, and Henrietta accepted it because it cost her nothing. Edith was paid her fee in the hall, counted out correct to the shilling by Mrs. Carslake, who did at least pay, and she walked the half-mile home through the spring evening with the empty linen folded over her arm and the 2 pieces of the torn card still in her apron pocket, where they had been for 2 days, because she had not been able to make herself throw them away. That was the state of things on the evening of the assembly, which Edith spent as she spent every evening, at her table with a lamp and her work, the window open to the smell of the river and the sound, faint and far up the hill, of music from Ashbury Court. She heard the carriage before she saw it. It was past 9. The good street of Larkfield was quiet, most of its windows dark, and into that quiet came the sound of a heavy coach taking the cobbles at a pace, the rattle and ring of it, and then the particular grinding settle of a large vehicle stopping outside a small house. Edith looked up from her work. Carriages did not stop in her street. She lived above what had been her father's shop, in a row of narrow houses where no one kept so much as a gig, and the sound of 4 horses pulling up at her own door was so far outside the ordinary that for a moment she simply did not believe it. Then there was a knock, firm and unhurried, and she went down. The carriage filled the street. It was dark, almost black, lacquered to a shine that held the lamplight, and on its door, picked out in dove-grey, was the crest she had last seen, torn in half on her workroom floor. A coachman sat above. A footman stood at the open door of it, and on her own step, hat in hand, stood a man she had never seen but knew at once, because there was only one man it could be. He was tall, and made taller by the way he stood, light brown hair, side-parted and combed back without a curl out of place, a claret-coloured tailcoat of a wool so fine it looked like water moving when he shifted his shoulders, a dove-grey waistcoat, a cravat of ivory tied close and plain. His face was not a warm face. It was a watchful one, all clean lines and pale green eyes that took in the whole of her, the lamp behind her, the needle still in her hand, the indigo apron, in a single unhurried sweep. "Miss Marlowe," he said. It was not a question. "Your Grace." She did not curtsy deeply. She inclined her head, the way one greets an equal one respects, and she saw something move behind his eyes when she did it, some small recalibration. "You are a long way from your assembly." "I'm aware of the distance. I drove it." He glanced once at the carriage behind him and back to her. "You did not come." For a moment, Edith could not make the sentence mean anything. Then she did, and the meaning of it went through her like cold water. "Your Grace, there has been some confusion. I had no card." "You had a card. I wrote it myself." His voice did not change, but something tightened at the corner of his jaw. "Mrs. Penhale put your name on no list. I added it. I have been watching the door of my own assembly for 2 hours, Miss Marlowe, and you didn't come through it. And I am not a man who enjoys being watched waiting for someone. So I have come to ask you why." There are moments that ask a person to choose in the space of a breath between the small protective lie and the true thing. Edith had spent 4 years choosing the small lie, because the small lie kept the work coming, and the peace kept. She looked at the Duke of Ashbury standing on her step in the lamplight, having driven 3 miles down a hill in the dark to ask her a question to her face, and she found that she did not want to lie to him. "I had a card," she said. "It was torn in half before I could answer it." She watched him understand. He was quick. The pale green eyes went still, and then very cold. Not at her, she saw, but past her, at something he was rapidly assembling. "By whom?" "That does not matter, Your Grace. It matters to me." A pause. "You sew for the Carslakes." It was not a guess. He knew the families of his country, as a careful man knows the accounts of his estate, and he had put it together in the time it took to say it. Edith said nothing, which was its own answer, and the Duke of Ashbury stood for a moment on her step with his hat in his hand, and a still, cold anger settling over him like the surface of a pond going to ice. Then he did a thing she did not expect. He stepped back and gestured to the open door of the carriage, and the gesture was not a command. It was an offer. "The assembly will go until 2, he said. "It is 9:30. You have made gowns for half the women in that room, and stood at none of their evenings. I find I would like you to stand at 1. A beat. I would take it as a personal favour, Miss Marlowe, if you would let me undo what was done to you on my behalf. The card was real, the invitation stands. And I have a carriage standing in the street, looking foolish." Edith looked at the carriage. She looked at the man. She thought of the midnight blue silk folded in her press upstairs, a length she had bought 2 years ago with money she should have saved and had never had the occasion to use, a thing she had cut and half made for herself in stolen hours and never finished because there had never been anywhere to wear it. "Give me 40 minutes, she said. Something in his face eased, not quite a smile, but the place a smile would go. "I have waited 2 hours. I can wait 40 minutes. She turned the midnight blue silk into a gown that fit her because it had always been cut to fit her, and the 40 minutes she had asked for she used in 35, and when she came down the narrow stair into the lamplight, the Duke of Ashbury, who had been standing in the street the entire time because he would not sit in a warm carriage while a lady dressed, turned and went very still. She had done her own hair, plainly, dark chestnut wound close. She had no jewels and wore none. The gown was the deep, clear blue of the hour after sunset, cut clean, with not one pearl or spangle on it, and it was, in its severity, the most elegant thing he had seen in a season of women who had spent fortunes to be looked at. He had admired her seams for 18 months. He had not been prepared for the woman inside them. "Miss Marlowe," he said, and the name came out differently than it had before. "Your Grace." She drew on her gloves. "You said until 2. The drive up the hill took 20 minutes, and they spent it talking, which neither of them had expected. He asked about the gallery curtains, because it was the safe thing and the true thing, and she told him about the difficulty of matching the old blue dye, how the original had been struck with a woad that no dyer in the county still kept, and how she had spent 3 weeks and a great deal of her own money testing 20 small samples in her window before she found a blend that would not shift toward green in the morning light. He listened to all of it, the whole technical length of it, the way a man listens who has himself spent 3 weeks on a thing that mattered. And at the end of it he said only, "I wondered why they held their colour. The old set in the dining room has gone to slate." And she said, "Because no one tested them in the morning light." And he was quiet a moment. And then he said, "No, I don't suppose anyone did." From there they went, by the natural road of 2 people who both took their work seriously, into a conversation that had nothing of the drawing-room in it, and everything of 2 craftsmen comparing the honest details of a thing made well. He found that she did not defer to him, and did not challenge him, but simply spoke to him as one careful person to another. And he could not remember the last time anyone had done that. The women of the county deferred. The men of his own rank competed. No one, in his memory, had simply talked to him, evenly, as though his title were a fact about him, no more interesting than the colour of his coat. She found that under the cold, exact surface there was a dry humour and a real attention, that when she spoke, he listened to the whole of it, and answered the actual thing she had said, not the thing he had decided in advance, she meant, and that this was so rare, she had to keep reminding herself not to stare. Outside the carriage window, the lights of Larkfield fell away below them, and the dark shoulder of the hill rose up, and the candles of Ashbury Court came into view above, and Edith looked at them and thought that she had made things that had lived in that house for 1.5 years longer than she had been permitted to stand in its rooms, and that this was a strange way to come at last to a place, by its curtains first and its door second. The assembly rooms above the Corn Exchange were ablaze. 300 candles, the long mirrors doubling them, the country's whole quality packed in and revolving in the slow figures of a dance, and the heat and the perfume and the noise of it came down the stair to meet them. The Duke of Ashbury offered Edith his arm. She took it, and they went up. What followed, the town would talk of for 1 year. The room did not fall silent all at once. It fell silent in a spreading ripple, beginning at the door and moving inward, as one face after another turned to see who the Duke had brought, and recognized her, and could not at first reconcile the 2 facts, that the woman on the Duke's arm was both unmistakably elegant and unmistakably Edith Marlowe, who hemmed their gowns. The music faltered and recovered. The slow turning of the dance went on, but every eye in the room had found the door. Edith felt the weight of all of it, and did not let it bend her. She had stood at the wall of rooms like this her whole life. The woman who had made the curtains, invisible. She was not invisible now. She kept her chin level and her hand light on the Duke's arm, and she let them look. She found Henrietta's face in the crowd without trying. It was not difficult. Henrietta stood near the musicians in the rose-pink gown with its 300 pearls, the gown Edith had made, and she was staring at the door with an expression that was trying to be several things at once and succeeding at none of them. Disbelief, outrage, and under both, dawning and dreadful, the beginning of a calculation about what this meant and how much it would cost her. Mrs. Carslake reached her daughter's side. Edith watched the older woman take it in, the Duke, the gown, the impossible fact of it, and watched her decide, with the instinct of a lifelong climber, that the only survivable course was to pretend there had never been any trouble at all. She came across the floor with both hands out and a smile fixed on like a brooch. "Your Grace, what an honour, and dear Miss Marlowe. How lovely, we are such friends. She does the most exquisite work, doesn't she, Henrietta? Didn't I always say so?" The Duke of Ashbury looked at Mrs. Carslake's outstretched hands and did not take them. He let the silence sit for exactly long enough to be unmistakable. Then he said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than the three of them, but with an edge that could have cut glass, "Miss Marlowe received an invitation to this assembly in my own hand. I am told it was torn in half before she could answer it. I would be glad to know that I am mistaken." The smile on Mrs. Carslake's face did not so much fall as freeze, holding its shape while everything behind it collapsed. Henrietta had gone the colour of her own gown, and here was the moment, the public scene the whole evening had been bending toward, and every person within hearing had stopped pretending not to listen. Edith could have let him do it. He was ready to. He would have flayed the Carslakes in front of the whole assembly, coldly and completely, and they would have deserved it, and it would have finished them in the county. She felt the wanting of it, a small hot thing, the satisfaction of watching the people who had treated her as furniture for 4 years undone in a single evening. She didn't take it. She did not raise her voice. She didn't let the satisfaction reach her face. She stepped, very slightly, so that she stood between the Duke and the Carslakes, and she said, in a voice that was perfectly level and reached only as far as it needed to, "There was a confusion about a card, Your Grace. It has been entirely resolved, as you see. I am here." It was a mercy, and everyone who heard it understood that it was a mercy, and that was worse for the Carslakes than any flaying could have been. Edith Marlowe, the seamstress, had just declined to destroy them, in front of the whole county, with 3 words, and in declining had shown the room exactly who in this small drama possessed the larger soul. Mrs. Carslake's frozen smile, Henrietta's stricken colour, the Duke's cold attention, and at the centre of it Edith, calm, choosing not to strike. The room read it instantly and entirely. It was the kind of public verdict no amount of money could buy back. "As you say," the Duke said quietly, watching Edith now rather than the Carslakes, and there was something in his face that had not been there at the bottom of the hill. "It is resolved." He turned from the Carslakes as if they had ceased to exist, which, socially, in that room, from that moment, they very nearly had. "Miss Marlowe, they are forming a new set. Will you dance?" Edith had not danced in a fine room in her life. She had watched 1,000 of these figures from the service stair and the dressmaker's kneeling crouch, and she knew them the way she knew everything, by careful observation and a good memory, and she found when the music took her that her feet knew the steps her eyes had learned. The Duke of Ashbury danced with her twice, which in that country was as good as a declaration, and the second time, near the end of the figure, when the turn brought them close, he said, "Lo, you might have let me ruin them. I confess I wanted to." "I know you did. Why did you not?" Edith considered the question through the next turn. "Because I have spent 4 years being made small by people who thought it made them larger," she said. "I find I do not wish to become a person who makes themselves larger by making someone small, even them, especially in your house." A beat. "Also it would have been vulgar, Your Grace, and you brought me here, and I did not want the evening to be vulgar." The Duke of Ashbury laughed. It was a short, surprised, entirely genuine sound, and several people turned to look, because no one in the county had heard the Duke of Ashbury laugh, and here he was doing it on a dance floor with the woman who made the curtains. The assembly went until 2, as he had said it would, He saw her down the hill himself in the black carriage, as the sky went grey at its eastern edge, and at her own door, in the cold, clean light before dawn, he did not let her go in at once. "I have a confession," he said. "I did not add your name to that list on a whim. I have known your work for 1.5 years. I have known your honesty for as long. I built, I think, a picture of a person from a set of curtains and a set of honest accounts, and I told myself it was foolish, because one cannot know a person from their seams." He paused. "I find tonight that the seams did not lie. You are exactly the woman I had no right to imagine you were, and a good deal more, and I have driven down this hill twice tonight, once to fetch you and once to bring you home, and I am not certain I want to do it a 3rd time, and leave." Edith stood on her own step, in the gown she had made for herself 2 years ago, with no occasion in mind, and she understood that the occasion had been this, all along, waiting. "Then do not," she said. He took her hand. He did not kiss her. Not then. He turned it over and looked at it, the small scars of the needle along the fingers, the calluses of honest work, and he pressed his mouth to the back of it, as one does to a queen's, and that, for that hour, was enough for both of them. "I will come tomorrow," he said, "properly, by daylight, with the carriage and no torn cards." "May I?" "You may." The first thing the Duke of Ashbury did the following morning, before he came down the hill, was sit at his study desk and write, in his own hand, a single line of instruction to his man of business, regarding the future placement of all custom from Ashbury Court and the families dependent upon his goodwill. The Carslakes did not need to be ruined. They had ruined themselves in one torn card before 300 witnesses, and the county had seen it. Custom is a tide. It went out. He did come the next day, by daylight, and the day after that, and through a spring that turned to summer, he came down the hill so often that the people of Larkfield stopped remarking on the black carriage in the narrow street and began, instead, to remark on what its frequency meant. What it meant was settled at midsummer, quietly, in the long gallery at Ashbury Court, beneath the curtains Edith had made before she had ever seen the man who owned them. He gave her a ring. She gave him, in return, a thing she had been working on in secret through the spring, and when he unwrapped it, he was silent for a long moment, because he understood it at once. It was the torn invitation. The 2 halves, which she had carried in her apron pocket for 2 days and never thrown away. She had not glued them. She had done the only thing she knew how to do, the only thing she had ever known how to do, with anything broken that was worth keeping. She had sewn them. Down the centre of the card, where Henrietta's hands had torn it, ran a line of the finest stitching he had ever seen, white silk thread no thicker than a hair, joining the crest on the left to her name on the right, the 2 halves not glued back into a pretence of never having been broken, but mended, openly, the seam shown and not hidden, stronger along the mend than the paper had ever been whole. "I could not make it as if it had never happened," Edith said. "I would not, even if I could. But it can be mended. Most things can, if you are willing to let the seam show." The Duke of Ashbury, who had built a picture of a woman from a set of curtains, and found the woman finer than the picture, held the mended card in both hands, and then he set it down with great care, and he kissed her at last, in the long gallery, beneath the blue curtains, in the honey-coloured light coming through the tall windows. They were married before the leaves turned. A year on, almost to the day, there was another assembly at Ashbury Court, the second the house had hosted in a decade, and this time the cards went out in the new Duchess's hand, as well as the Duke's, and one of them carried a name that surprised the county. For Edith had made an inquiry, quietly, over the winter. She had learned that Henrietta Carslake, the family's custom gone and its ambitions collapsed, had been sent to keep house for an aunt in a far county, a come-down she felt every hour of every day, and that she had, in the year of her exile, done a remarkable thing for a girl who had never sewn a straight seam. She had learned to sew. Out of boredom at first, and then, the aunt wrote, out of something that looked almost like penance, she had taken up a needle, and she was, the aunt admitted, not without a gift for it. So the new Duchess of Ashbury sent a card in her own hand to the stepsister who had torn her last one in half. There was no crest of forgiveness on it, and no grand gesture in it. It was only an invitation, plainly written, to come and see whether a person who had learned to mend things with her own hands might be received in a house where mending was understood. What Henrietta did not know, opening it in her aunt's cold parlour in a far county, was that the Duchess had written the card at the desk in the long gallery beneath the blue curtains, with the mended invitation framed on the wall above her, where she could see it as she wrote. The seam showed. It always would. That was the whole of the point. Henrietta Carslake came to the assembly. She stood for much of the evening near the wall, as Edith once had, and watched the bright turning room, and learned, slowly, across the hours, what it is to be received by someone you have wronged, and find that they have chosen, of all the things they might have done, simply to make a place for you. Near the end of the night, the Duchess crossed the floor to where her stepsister stood at the wall, and didn't make a scene of it, and didn't extract an apology, and didn't refer to the card at all. She only put out her hand. "There is supper laid in the gallery," Edith said. "Come and sit by me. I want to hear about your work." And Henrietta, who had torn one invitation in half and been undone by it, took the hand of the woman she had wronged and let herself be led in to supper beneath the blue curtains, past the small framed card on the wall, with the seam running white and unhidden down its centre, mended, and the stronger for it, exactly along the line where it had broken.